What's up, guys? Joey here. As you may know, I've been overclocking for over 10 years as a DIY home enthusiast. I'd go as far as saying I'm a bit of a super enthusiast because I follow like everything to do with the new technology releasing, overclockers, not necessarily liquid nitrogen, but more about the tech, like how the overclocking works, how the BIOSes are changing, how the voltages are changing in regards to automatic algorithms like PBO, and we've got this CPPC thing here that's come up with the later versions of Windows. And I basically do a lot of my own testing off camera. And if you've been following my channel for any amount of time, you'd know that I had a 6700K that I tuned myself. I delidded, and I was running that at 4.5 gigahertz. It's still going. It's on my kid's PC now, and it's still stable. It runs load at like 55 degrees at 4.5 gigahertz. And then I got a 3600, which undervolted extremely well, way better than anything PBO could do on a like PBO doesn't even have a curve on the 3600s. And then I kept reading, like in all the Reddit like threads to do with overclocking and people sharing their results. I see a lot of this group, I don't know what to call it, crab mentality, of random people will come into a post where someone shared an all-core overclock, and they'll come in and say, "Why are you even bothering with it? It's not like," because they've watched a YouTube video where there's this misinformation going around that all-core is no good compared to PBO. But I can tell you right now that through extensive testing, like this is weeks, probably months now, because I actually have a ton of testing. If I zoom out a bit, I have a ton of testing I did off camera just to see how the CPU was behaving, how in regards to temperature, and how the PBO was handling different settings. Like you can set a curve, but then if you set too much of a curve and it's not giving enough voltage, it'll get clock stretching, so then your performance goes down, even though you're seeing high single core frequencies. And I don't even understand the mentality behind single core frequencies mattering that much, because all the new games tend to use more than two threads. Okay, all of them. Like I can't even think. Maybe Microsoft Flight Simulator. I can't really think of anything that doesn't use more than a few threads. And then we all have fast SSDs, and we're all alt tabbing and multitasking these days, where it's mind-boggling where people will still argue that PBO is superior because you'll get higher single when your multi will go to crap, or your temperatures will go to crap if you're not running the best cooling possible. So this testing was done on a stock cooler, not a stock cooler, a budget cooler, sorry, that was about $30 US. So the reason I wanted to share this is because when they give advice on the big tech channels saying that all core is no good, PBO is superior, don't waste your time with all core, and their test bench is using top of the line cooling, does that reflect what the majority of users are building? The majority of users are more likely to be in the budget category, and they're more likely to get a cheaper cooler just to get a better CPU. So they'll go with like a 5600X with a cheap cooler rather than a 3600 with an expensive cooler, if that makes any sense. So you'll have to cut corners somewhere. And I know a lot of people would tend to cut corners on either the PSU, which thankfully that has died down now. Like people know to invest in a decent quality power supply, or they'll cut corners in their case sometimes. Or the other area is really just your CPU cooler. That's like the main one, because you don't want to skimp on your and the motherboard. But you want a decent motherboard. You want the best CPU possible, the best GPU possible, decent RAM. And it's like the easy area, that the one that's left at the end is the CPU cooler. So given how well some of these CPU coolers sell, you can literally go to Amazon, or if you're in the Philippines like me, go to Lazada or Shopee. You can punch in a few of the top model CPU coolers, or the popular CPU coolers. If you put in 360mm to 240mm AIOs, hardly anyone has left any feedback. Like there's feedback, like 50 feedback. But then if you put in something like the Deepcool Gammaxx, which is a very popular air cooler in the budget category, there's hundreds and hundreds of, even from all different sellers, each have hundreds of feedback. That tells me everyone's buying that. So that's where this advice comes in, is if you're temperature limited, PBO sucks, quite plainly, compared to stock. Like I'll just bring it up here. If I'm running stock, like you can see here, 1.142 volts, and the idles and everything very good. 49 amps of current. I don't want to get too into this because it gets too technical, where if you're not that tech savvy, you'll just be like, so what does that mean? But the basics of it is, if you're on a budget cooler, stock runs coolest. And so if you want to run PBO, there has to be some benefit at the end of the day where your performance is noticeably better under PBO. And there is not a massive difference when you're comparing, say, stock to, let's see here, stock to PBO on a -10 curve or on a -30 curve. On a -10 curve, your temps will go up by 5 to 6 degrees, at least on my setup, and I do have good airflow, but the ambients are high, like I'm in a 30C ambient room. And this red one here is PBO. This red, wait, I'll light it up. PBO on the stock limits. So that's the stock limits of the CPU set, like as if you have PBO disabled, but you're just letting the PBO algorithm push as hard as it can with the stock PPT, where are they? The stock PPT, TDC, and EDC limits. So normally PBO will actually be unlocked. So when it's unlocked, it'll use the motherboard limits, which are like unlimited basically. And if you do that, your temps will shoot up over 10 degrees, which is this middle one here, -25 on the curve. So I even tried to undervolt with it. But what I did on this one, I'm pretty sure I increased the limits. And when I increased the limits, the temperature just wanted, this was only slightly increased, sorry. The temperature just wanted to climb up and up and up. It was just pointless, like on a budget cooler. So you have to keep it into context. Is that on a budget cooler, I was seeing poor PBO behavior. And when I Reddit search and I look up what other people's experiences are, people that are running in higher temperature environments or not on the top of the line cooling are all giving the same responses. And the general advice to those people is you've got to put the limits back. So you've got to end up playing with your limits. Like you've got to reduce the temperature by adding these limits back in. And that ends up to be a tedious, like a very tedious endeavor. So while the big tech sites are saying, oh, it's quick and easy, just use PBO, don't waste your time with all-core, it can take you a lot longer to tune in PBO when you're having to play with those limits to get it just right compared to an all-core, which can take you half an hour to dial in. And I'll just give you an example here. These two top results were my all-core tuning, 45 times all-core and 46 times. Look at these temperatures here. Now, these temperatures are all well within limits. Even up to like 80 degrees is fine. But I'm just doing a comparison of running on a budget cooler, which one's giving me the best temperatures, and which feature took me the longest to dial in, like to get a decent result. And the 45 and the 46 took me about half an hour each. Less than half an hour in terms of tuning, like maybe it was only 10 minutes of tuning, like rebooting in a few times, finding a voltage that I felt was, okay, I'm gonna stress test this voltage, and then the actual stress testing took a little bit longer, like maybe it was a full hour in total. And both of those I've tested extensively since, and they've proven to be like 24-hour stable, running the computer basically from morning to night till the next day. And I haven't had any crashing, any BSODs, anything like that on 45 or 46 times. And both of these all-core undervolt / overclocks just took me a short amount of time to tweak in. Meanwhile, I was playing with PBO for 3 days straight, and I wasn't getting the results I wanted. The only good thing I can say about PBO is that you're idle, full idle, when you're not touching anything on the keyboard and the mouse. When you sit at the desktop full idle, you will have lower current and overall power consumption on your CPU. So as you can see here, the full idle temperatures, idle current, was 0.7 amps. So that not even 1 amp at full idle using PBO or using the stock PBO disabled. But using the all-core, this is where some people will say that that's why all-core is bad. You do have more idle current, but this is only at full idle. So if you're going to leave your computer at idle for like 5 hours every day, obviously that's where you'd want PBO or stock. But if you're actually using your computer whenever you sit at the desk and you're only leaving it idle for 10 minutes at a time, as soon as you start moving the mouse, like I'm using PBO right now because I'm actually doing testing for another video. But if I open hardware info, just so you guys can see what I mean, this idle current that is beneficial when you're running on the default curves only really helps you at 100% idle, not at, like if you're just 5% usage, you're just moving your mouse around, you're not going to be sitting at 1 amp of current. The CPU wakes up, and once the CPU is awake, once there's a little bit of work coming in, even if you just have a background app like a torrent running, you'll end up at a higher current. Sorry, my window's actually big because I'm recording at 1080p to make it easier for anyone on 1080p to see rather than my ultra wide resolution. So on the latest hardware info, they actually moved it around. The current used to be in the CPU category, but it's moved down here to VDD current. So this is roughly the idle current that I've measured here in this other window. So as you can see, just with me recording on ReLive, and I'm sitting at the desktop with two windows open, and a lot of people, even if you do go AFK, you'll probably have like a browser window open, right? You'll be reading something, you'll be watching a stream, you'll pause it. If you just have any background load, you won't get any of this nice idle current, which is the main benefit of PBO and stock for a casual user. You'll actually just have you'll have above what an all-core will give you. So you can just see here, the minimum it's gone to, although I am recording with ReLive, that is a GPU heavy workload. It's not a CPU heavy workload. This is doing it all on the GPU, but 10 amps. So in other words, even 5 amps is basically meaningless when you think about average load. So, and this is where I wanted to share something else, is when you're streaming, when you're doing actual activity on the computer, and then you compare all-core versus PBO or stock, you'll actually find that if your all-core is low enough, if you've got a decent CPU, it can undervolt a little bit. You're running lower than stock voltage. As you can see, PBO and stock limits had a BIOS vCore of 1.27 volts. And once you're under any kind of light load, I did have it listed here somewhere. I'm going to maximize this. Where is it? Did I log it in? I do have screenshots as well that I can just reference to. But basically, from my own testing, just word of mouth right now, when you're under any kind of light load, and you're using PBO, you'll end up at a higher overall, like you're not at full idle, you'll have higher overall power consumption, vCore, and current. So your wattage, all of it will be higher compared to an all-core. And that's where I've seen this misinformation going around. They're basically saying it like it's set in stone, and they're not informing users, hey, well, if you could take a little bit of time and try to lower your vCore down, try to do an all-core, and if you can get under 1.2 volts, roughly, which is usually below what the automated algorithms are giving, you could end up with better overall power consumption and temps under any load except for full idle. And that would be an accurate way to advise users, hey, you can actually tweak your CPU a bit. There is some benefit, however small it may be, where you can have a cooler running system. And so that effect really happens at anything other than full idle. So full idle is just where you're not moving the mouse. Everything is closed. There's no background processes. There's no torrents, nothing. That is where you'll see the PBO pull ahead with the idle current and voltage. But as you can see here, like, because you can see these idle, the idle vCore was dropping. But again, in hardware info, you can also see here the idle vCore if you've been looking at that at the chart while I'm talking. The reason I put an asterisk here is because the hardware info or your monitoring tools do not record parked voltage. So even though hardware info was saying I was at 1.1 with all core, it's because I'm not getting the same telemetry from the CPU to the app as you do with the stock algorithms that report to hardware info that they are downstepping and they are dropping down in voltage. The place you see it is in Ryzen Master. And if you open Ryzen Master, even on an all-core undervolt, you'll actually see your idle voltages dropping to similar levels, like 0.8, under 1 volt. But long story short, none of this matters if you're not at full idle all the time. If you're gaming, if you're doing any of that, I'll just scroll across here. So these two are I'll just keep them highlighted. So the rest from here down, in the top one stock, the rest down are all PBO tuning that I was attempting to try to tune in something decent, because my goal here is not max performance, because real world performance gains are not that big. My goal was to see, does my performance improve along with temps, or do my temps get worse? And if I scroll here, you can just see here in the middle, the load current, even at 4.6 gigahertz, this blue one here, blue is good, and green is what I consider the best for what you're getting, the best bang for buck. And as you can see, as soon as we moved away from stock, our multi went up to 4400 to 4500. And our single is still decent, 560, 580. This was with the Windows 11 bug, though. I was testing under Windows 11. So a lot of this testing got kind of invalidated in terms of peak performance. I believe PBO can perform better with the CPPC bug fixed. But in terms of the latency, that shouldn't have mattered because they were all at the same 30ns L3 cache latency. So it shouldn't have mattered really because it's apples to apples. It's just that the CPPC behavior would have benefited PBO a little bit more. But at the end of the day, when I did this testing, I was able to get PBO to improve the single results, but every single time, even all the way up to plus 100, plus 150 on the curve, even though I was seeing the single go up, the multi was kind of cruddy, and the temperatures were just like, you can just see here, like 63 versus 68. And I know these are very, very small margins. These are not bad temperatures. Like 68 is nothing. You can run 80, like closer to 80, just to be fine. But the higher your temps go on a budget cooler, just keep in mind budget cooling, okay? The higher your temps go, it affects the curve. And if the curve's affected, because of the algorithm of PBO, your performance is also affected. So that's why you can also see that my multis were going down the harder I tried to push this thing. And it just was so inconsistent. I think the inconsistency might have been related to CPPC as well, though, because I got more consistent testing with the new patches. But this is just mainly to show you, though, what 3 days of testing got me versus less than 2 hours total testing with the two all-core tuned. Like, you can just see how much. Like, if you're running a 5600X and you've got PBO and you're on a stock, not a stock cooler, but you're on a budget cooler that's under like $150, you're not on a 360mm AIO. If you're on a air cooler, try running CBR20 multi and see if you can beat my scores. Like, I literally would like to know, and what voltage you were getting and everything like that, because unless my CPU is a dud, which I don't think it is because it undervolts very well, you'll see negative scaling compared to what I'm showing here. So you'll see high temps, probably closer to 70, and then those aren't high temps in terms of damage or risk to the CPU. They're just high in relation to stock and to an all-core. So that's why I've color-coded these like orange and red. It's like, well, these are just going up and up. And this was using very low limits. I wasn't even unlocking it to motherboard limits. So no doubt, if I had unlocked it to motherboard limits, these would have been 75 plus, 75 degrees. And that's where you get those posts on Reddit. Like, my CPU is running hot. I've got pretty good cooling. Why is it running so hot? Why is it getting so warm under medium-ish loads, like under gaming loads? And I'll show you my gaming temps here to kind of show you what I mean. The top one is just PBO on stock limits without any curve tuning. And then the second one's minus 10 curve, which is a little bit better. But these two middle ones are the all-core temperatures. And so in regards to actual performance, even on the 19 minimum, I think that was, because that was in Odyssey, that was more of a one-off. I reckon if I'd rerun the benchmark, it would have been higher. Like, it was in margin of error because the 1440p went up to 23. So if it could get 23 in 1440p, it should have been able to do it in, But main point being is that if you just look at these temperatures, the PBO stock was 67 degrees, right, for 35 to 77 FPS. The 4600 megahertz all-core was 56 degrees. That is 11 degrees cooler. So, looking at that, and I also did note down the ambience. I do have the temperature in my room. So the ambient on the all-core 4.6 was 1 degree higher in these two tests. Or all of the tests, actually. So you can just see here, every single one was worse by up to 10 degrees for PBO. And then the next one I recorded, I was trying to get the temperatures down. This middle one that I put in blue, I think I skipped because it was no good from the preliminary testing under Signbench. When I saw Signbench wasn't giving that good of a result, I figured there's no point doing all the game tests. And I selectively picked out which PBO ones I should test to try to make it fair, because it's just going to look worse if I test in another bad setting. So minus 30 curve, I believe, was the one where, and it was stable. There wasn't negative scaling. It was scaling upwards from stock. So you can see here 587, 4364, and that's where my mentality was like, okay, even though the temps are a little bit high at 67 degrees in relative to all-core, this should be fine for a game test. So when I tested it, yes, the game temps were much better with the 30 curve. But then that's with 30 curve and the stock limits. If I had unlocked the stock limits, it still would have shot up again. That's just how PBO seems to behave. So if you're in a if you're in a country with very low ambience under 25 degrees and you've got decent cooling, PBO is definitely something I would look at. But the way that the tech websites and all of the tech journalists are advertising PBO as being the be all and end all and all core, and the crab mentality, just with people posting on Reddit. If I see someone post an all core overclock on Reddit for a Ryzen CPU, I'm interested. I want to look and see what they got. And I'm just seeing people come in that I don't know where their experience is, but they're just coming in saying, why are you using all core anyway? Because all core can be better. So it does depend on your cooling. Like maybe they're using all core because it gets some better results and they've tried PBO just like me. So you can just see here though, this minus 30 curve, we got almost the same temps as the 4600 megahertz all core in terms of temperatures, but then for some reason Shadow of the Tomb Raider tends to be more intensive or more consistently intensive. The temps were still up compared to 4.6 gigahertz overclock, and in both, there's no way. I even did multiple runs in some of these. Like I've got all the screenshots in a folder, but I was screenshotting everything to kind of have a bit of a backup if anyone did question my testing. And this was using the in-game benchmark. So the only difference would have been ambient room temperature changes. 33C ambient here. It was a little warmer in the room when I was doing these tests. But again, it shouldn't have mattered that much at these kinds of load temperatures anyway. But you can just see here that for some reason, Shadow of the Tomb Raider was high. And then in the 1440p, where it shifted the load a bit more to the GPU, I'm guessing. I'm not sure why 1440p, but the temperature went down, 57. So this was minus 30 curve. And the game temp, how did I check the game temp again? That was just the maximum temperature, sorry, in hardware info. The maximum log temperature at the end of testing all four games, all four settings. So, Odyssey, 1080, 1440, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And then this is where I get into further testing. So I kind of have to explain to give context to what I did. After all of this testing and seeing how cruddy PBO was behaving, it was just very inconsistent. Even at the bottom here, I went stock and I tried using offset voltages because I wasn't happy with the max curve. Because I know that the CPU, my CPU in particular, is stable at 1.14 for 45 or 1.19 for 46. But PBO with a minus 30 curve was still hitting around 1.2 volts. And you can just see here the load vCore in hardware info was still hitting 1.2. And then when I did minus 30 curve and I got some negative scaling, I don't know if it was the TDC limits or the fact that I was affecting the curve by adding megahertz. Up to 150 I was stable, and at 200 I crashed at minus 30 curve. So it kind of showed that there was headroom, but I didn't get right into the nitty gritty fine tuning of curve and boost because the temperatures were just negatively scaling. And then I tried using stock offset, and then I did manage to get some really nice temperature and power with stock offset. But the problem is it not throttled, but it clock stretched really hard because it wasn't getting enough power. So 495 and 3790. Well, it was getting enough power technically. As you can see here, 1.138 and 1.15 are plenty for a 45 times all core, but the algorithm thought it wasn't getting enough power, is lack of a better way to explain it. And that also affected the overall performance compared to all core, where I was losing like 7 FPS, 8 FPS here if we just compare it to the 45 and 46. And from this initial testing, my own personal choice, after looking at these numbers and going, okay, well, so it was about within 5 FPS for all of the testing, which one is better for someone that's usually sitting at the PC using it? And for me, it would have been the 45 times all core, so this row here. As you can see, the gaming temp is phenomenal, or stock. Even stock is fine. But stock PBO disabled, not PBO enabled, because PBO enabled was here. The PBO just, even at stock limits with the motherboard, TDC and all that limits in place, the same limits that default the PBO algorithm wants to just push as hard as it can for whatever limits you give it, and it wanted to go to 70 degrees. And this is relevant because if you were running a stock cooler, which a lot of people still are, this kind of scaling is what you'll see. You'll see this kind of scaling if you're temperature limited, and you might be running a stock cooler at 79 degrees, where you're like actually trying to get your temps down, and PBO's enabled. Just disabling PBO could drop your temps by up to 10 degrees, if not more. So just wanted to share that. And then after all that testing, this was still with the CPPC bugs, though, that I was not completely aware of. I knew there was an issue with latency, but I figured, it's apples to apples. All the testing had the same 30 ns latency. But I went into further testing where I picked out what I felt were the most optimal PBO settings to try with 75 here, which even though the temp's a bit high, tended to be one of the... Wait. I've got 75 somewhere else that I tested again. Is it this row? Or was it down here? Sorry. I'm getting a little bit mixed up. I tried 75 hertz again because it looked good in regards to, so minus 3075, it was looking good in regards to here, the CBR scaling. So it had the best single and a respectable multi, like still a pretty crappy multi in regards to all-core, but it was one of the better ones, except the only one that might have been a little bit better than that was the increased limits, but our temps were just climbing. This was 4 degrees cooler, so I felt this was the optimal one, the minus 30 curve plus 75. So when I went into Warzone testing, that's what I went with, minus 30 curve, just to see what it does by default, if there's any better temps, worse temps, etc. And I also redid a lot of the testing to add in the idle vCore, looking at Ryzen Master specifically, and looking at the right places in hardware info. So when I did that, the all-core on this chart are at the bottom, so the bottom two with the orange higher idle. And you can see here, we're getting 5 watts higher at full idle, completely full idle. 5 watts higher and 4 amps, or 3 to 4 amps higher, which isn't much. It's negligible, really, unless you're sitting at idle for really long periods of time. What we're more interested in is our load current and voltage higher under all-core, because that's what a lot of people will argue with you. Like they'll say, all-core is no good, it uses more power, it pushes more current. It doesn't. Even the best undervolt you can do on PBO, because PBO only gives you the negative curve, even a minus 30 curve at stock limits cannot surpass a tuned all-core undervolt. So if we just look here, the two bottom ones are all-core, 51 and 55 amps. 55 amps is on 4.6 gigahertz. I was getting a lower on 4.6 gigahertz all-core, and lower, everything was lower. The vCore was lower, the load current was lower, the core power, the wattage was lower, the temperature was about on par, so the temperature was actually getting pretty close. But then look at the result. The multi was still better. The single was roughly on par. It was performing actually a lot better in this one where I had lower ambient room temps, because I ran the AC for the PBO testing, and because the all-core was done last, I did that on purpose, because all-core is not affected by temperatures as much as PBO, because it's not an algorithm. All-core is just locked at whatever speed. You don't get clock stretching on all-core, and that's where I gave PBO the advantage by testing it with the AC on, and by the time the room had heated up, I was at 30C ambient for the all-core testing. And as you can see, even at 30C ambient, 2 degrees higher, I would have had better temps had it been at 28C. So these would have been like 57 and 61. I would have overall had better across the board. So if you factor those ambients in, all-core 1 in terms of power and temps, and then we look at the scores where the 4.5 wasn't anywhere near as good as PBO or as 4.6, but the multi was still respectable. But more importantly, look at the temps. The temps were still very good and not as affected. This is the other thing that you've got to keep in mind, is that the stock algorithms are affected by room temperature and your ambient and your cooler much more than an all-core. So if you just want consistent performance, like when you're gaming for a few hours, the all-core might give you that more consistent performance, because I know there's people that make these posts. The game runs good when I first start, and then half an hour in, it starts running crap. That's where your temperatures have probably climbed to a point where your cooler is not in a good fan curve, and the algorithm is trying to compensate for that and adjusting itself, but that the adjustment leads to worse performance. So just so you can see here, I'll go into the. You can also see the Cinebench R20 multi testing with hardware info. You can actually see your effective multiplier, which is where your clock stretching occurs. On 4.5, and we had like exact scaling, so the effective was 4.6, for example, for all core. And then with the PBO, even though we were seeing a multi-frequency of 4.625 to 4.6, it was under 4.6, which is why we see, and it was directly like, it was matching up with what I was seeing. Like, we were seeing slightly less effective multi. The multi was down a bit, and then without PBO, the multi was up. So it was the type of scaling you'd expect to see, but it's just to kind of emphasize the difference between multi and PBO. Is that multi and all core, is that all core is just a lot more consistent with performance. And then when we went into the actual gaming, performance was so similar that the only thing to compare was the temperatures and voltage. It's kind of like, okay, so now if we're just going to be a gamer that wants to tune their CPU a little bit, what do gamers aim for? You want consistency, consistent low temperatures, which improves consistency. And if there's a performance improvement, you can take it. But if that performance improvement comes at an extra 5 degrees, some gamers might choose to just run their CPU cooler because it means more stable over long periods of gaming. So as you can just see here, I've lighted these up blue because the voltages, the power consumption, everything was just better. Like I recorded all of these values out of hardware info. So hardware info was running and reset at the start of every session. So at 3440 by 1440, margin of error I wouldn't even try to say, because Warzone is so it's just such a hard game to benchmark. All I could look at was the averages and the 1% lows, and just give it margin of error. So let's just say that within 5 to 10 FPS is margin of error. And the results were actually pretty decent because I kept trying to drop into the same areas. But you can just see here, if we call 5 FPS margin of error, the only thing to really look at is the temperatures, which self-explanatory. And then we move on to 1440. Like, we're going to increase the load on the CPU now. Once we moved on to 1440, my testing got messed up a bit. I only had Clash because they ran an update, and I tested the first 3 PBOs, and then the update dropped in where they removed Clash, and I wasn't able to test all core. So this is kind of invalid, and that kind of screwed up because I was like I just picked a really bad time to do the benchmarks, and then I redid it just underneath. So you don't have to go looking through all of it again. I just copied the important things, so you can see the PBO setting and 45 or 46, and I just chose -30 curve stock limits only, because adding +75 was seeing negative scaling in terms of temperatures. So if I have better temps, like 4 degrees better temps on -30 curve without the +75, and the FPS is roughly the same or even slightly more consistent, then that's why I just chose to use the -30 without the 75. And you can see here I went to Plunder, because Plunder is reliable, right? They're not going to take Plunder away until they did with the recent patch. So if we look here on Plunder, 3440 by 1440, still in Plunder with more testing in the same areas, I was getting the same nice 5 degrees nicer temperatures and within margin of error for performance. 45 times was down a little bit. You can just see here, like, I can't fake this stuff. Both the average and the 1% were down. And that's how I knew 45 was obviously underperforming stock or PBO. But again, if you had a temperature issue, you might still want to run a 45 times, especially on a stock cooler. And then we look at 46, which matches up with PBO. It can compete. It's competitive. The average was higher, but again, margin of error because it's Warzone. But just look at the temperatures and the power consumption, which is one of the things people argue about, that all-core has worse temperatures. All-core has worse power consumption. The current was lower, so how can it be worse? The V-core was lower and the current were lower. It wasn't like people argue, oh, you can have 1.4 volts because it's the current that's dangerous. Well, if the current and the volts are lower, it's better. So yeah, we'll go into the CPU bound one here, and we were getting much higher FPS, but you can see here that 90 on the 4.5, so it's still not as good performance. You definitely are losing performance if you use a 45 multiplier. But 46, which is around about where stock and PBO will boost to for single, not necessarily for multi. But 46 was performing better, but still within margin of error. And so then if we just rule out the FPS, if we just pretend we're not going to count this because it's all within 10 FPS of each other, then the temperatures and the power consumption is where you might want to look at, because you're playing for however many hours a day. Whichever one's going to give you a bit of savings on your power bill tends to be the next best thing to look at. It's the only other variable, really. So I still would pick all core for the lower V-core and the lower average temperatures. And then I moved on to 1080p, which is where you'll see even more of a difference. And it's starting to, actually it was about the same here on this one. What was my ambient? The ambient was lower. So 29C on the ambient for the PBO -30 curve did get us higher performance because it was boosting better and decent temperatures, 59 degrees, right? But the voltage, the current, and the power were all up, higher than a 46 times all-core. And the 46 times all-core's performance was doing so at 33 degrees. So when you factor in this ambient difference of 4 degrees, it basically means that the all-core would have been running 4 degrees cooler, so closer to 55 degrees, which is insanely good. If you're worried about temperatures, or if you're temperature limited for some reason, you could have been running a cheaper cooler than me. And I'm running a Gammaxx Pro, which is a dual fan cooler with a mesh case with high airflow. If you just simply had a closed case front panel or one less fan on your intake, you could end up in a much more temperature throttled scenario where the all-core is going to outperform PBO. So yeah, just to share that, I wanted to. This is testing that does not really count, though. I just wanted to take it with a grain of salt because of the CPPC issue. There is a chance that when I retest all of this with CPPC enabled, fixed on Windows 11, that the PBO will somehow blow it out of the water. But in terms of power and temps, I don't think it will. I don't think a CPPC core swapping, core priority, preferred core bug would drastically change the power consumption or the temps. It would only affect the performance to some degree. So we might see some better frame rates, but we're not going to see better temps, I don't think. So anyway, we'll just look here, though. I also did a little bit of downtown testing to try to make it as consistent as possible. I'll put this link down in the comments because I did actually share this, even though I wasn't really telling people what I was doing. When I went to the same spot in downtown, which is one of the more intensive areas of the map in Warzone, this was the result. And I tested more PBO, like I did PBO plus 20% to the limits, and you can see these stock limits and the plus 20% here. This is only a tiny increase to what the motherboard gives you by default if you put it on motherboard limits. But you can see the temps were actually all within margin of error. It was actually pretty good, but we weren't getting much positive scaling running in the same areas. I saw higher stock PBO with the -30 curve without any limit increase. So maybe that was contributing to the, like when it was running a little bit hotter, it was somehow contributing to the stability of the frame rate, or it's just margin of error for. But like it almost looks like there's a pattern here with all core scaling downwards, because I saw an average of only 116 this time in downtown on the all core. But if you actually watch the video, when my FPS dropped, this is why Warzone is a bitch to test. When my FPS average was 116, my squad dropped with me into downtown at the same building, and simply having players in your vicinity running around drops your FPS average by a considerable amount. While these other ones, I was shooting some players like you can watch the whole video, but I was shooting at players and getting into fights, but my team wasn't with me, and the players were noticeably far away. They weren't like right next to me in the same building, a whole squad. So when I had my squad running around with me, I noticed that when I went over the video again, over the gameplay footage, that was one of the reasons why my FPS seemed to be a lot lower. And then when the squad was like off screen, further away, you'd see my average climb up. But in the overall benchmark, the average was down. So, I can't trust this 116. I think it was closer to 120, 130, matching up with the other tests. But it's just because it's Warzone. Like, I don't have a fixed benchmark I can run. And then the other thing is, if I went to a certain part of the map and ran down a road with nothing around, that's also useless because it's not a real world test. Like, at least run around and loot stuff, So anyway, after that, we could only look at the temperatures, and then I just deduced that 45 all-core, given the performance within, even the 1%, 88 versus 91, and this is in downtown, one of the hard areas to run. Within 5 FPS margin of error, the temps were 4 degrees cooler, 4 to 5 degrees cooler, and the ambients were all the same. I ran the AC the whole time, except for the last one. The room had heated up too much, even with the AC on. And these are AC temps in a tropical country, so you can imagine how bad the temps are if I just left the AC off all day and did some gaming. But anyway, this has kind of turned into a really long-winded video. But at the very least, sharing this info for people interested. I'll have this stuff linked in the comments below. I'll probably link the spreadsheet. You can have a look through it. I do have to upload all the screenshots of all the testing I did. I even took screenshots of Warzone just to show you that I'm not like basically, because it's always like a question in the back of your mind when you see people that do testing, did they actually do it? And you can see here, this was the Warzone tests. I have basically screenshots for the ends of the matches. And this was for the end testing. This was the downtown testing, and in here was the main testing I did at the top. But again, not entirely relevant in terms of performance because of the CPPC issue. And the Warzone testing, it's mainly just this one, I think. I'm not sure if I got screenshots of every single run that I did, but then I was recording for a lot of it too. I did upload some of it. And I didn't link all of it. It was mainly the plunder downtown that I figured, well, at least this is enough. This preliminary testing is not really relative when I wasn't able to complete his Clash disappeared. So it kind of turned into a waste of time to even log it. But I do have this stuff logged, like this CPR testing, so if you trust me or don't trust me. But anyway, the original point of this video is because I'm still ongoing with testing. And then when I wanted to test more plunder with the CPPC patch, and plunder's gone because of the Halloween event. So I'm kind of stuck now. Do I try to test? Because I don't know. I have to get all the testing done within the same patch, and then I don't know if they're going to take something away and which mode to pick, which is the most popular mode. I'm not like playing Warzone religiously. I've actually been playing a lot of Genshin Impact. So if you know what's the most popular mode in Warzone and I get enough comments for it, that's what I'm going to use to my testing. I'll change this. But otherwise, I'm just going to wait till I can do Plunder Downtown because that seems to be the more reliable method because I can replicate it easily. And it's not the same as a Battle Royale where if you die, you get kicked out of the game. In Plunder, the worst thing that can happen, I can just drop straight back in to the downtown area. But when you've got the circle closing, it's kind of like you can't really accurately test that easily. So anyway, the original purpose of this video was to show that I'm actually doing CPPC fix testing, which now that the CPPC and the latency have been fixed, I'm redoing all my tests under those fixes in Windows 11. And preliminary testing, I have not done the gaming testing yet. This is what it looks like. I only tested stock PBO disabled. As you can see, though, the stock PBO disabled does perform fairly well, especially in gaming. The gaming is within margin of error from my before fix testing. So you can see here where stock PBO was performing even better than PBO minus 30 curve 20% limits. So the main purpose of the CPPC testing is to show which combination of CPPC is best. Because I have seen people asking that question on Reddit. Should I use CPPC on or off, or preferred on or preferred off? So I tested all the, common sense, like you wouldn't run CPPC off preferred on. You'd have them both on together or preferred off. So in that testing, I found that CPPC on preferred off seemed to be the most consistent, but all of them were within margin of error. Just turns out that way. Except for, like you can see here, though, that PBO disabled, so this is the stock algorithm, seem to, so just look at this top one here. I do have an extra test on the CPPC on preferred off because this is the mode that I choose for my more thorough testing is that I use -30 curve with stock PBO disabled, because there's a bug in the MSI BIOS where if you enable PBO, activate the -30 curve, and then disable PBO, the -30 curve remains active even though PBO is disabled, and you end up with stock undervolt. Yeah, basically it's a way to undervolt the stock setting. So by full stock is 1.204 volts, and stock with the PBO -30 curve enable disable bug is 1.142 volts, which matches up exactly with my 45 times all core, and it's stable, obviously. And if you try to just like use an offset to get the same thing, you can. If you use offset with the default algorithms, it will cause clock stretching, and you'll just get worse performance. So when I actually did this trick and retested with the CPPC fix, I did see a massive improvement compared to testing I had done previously. So you can see here this middle one. The single was higher and the multi was higher, and I was seeing 4650. I don't know what's up with the effective multi in hardware info. Like, it just always reports something low. But I was seeing 4650, but no clock stretching, even though the effective was showing a low number. I was getting 4500 CBR multi. So yeah, but basically when I tested them, like if I go through the top here, 45 was winning in CPPC off, preferred off, but then if you just compare 45 with CPPC off, preferred off, if you just compare it here, 582, 4441, and then the all core was completely unaffected in every single one. You can just see here, it's within like a few points, margin of error. And then if we look at, this is what it should affect, is the single core scores. When we look at CPPC completely off, the stock algorithm was 584 on single, 4266 on multi. The multi, I don't think will matter that much. And we can see here that all three modes had roughly the same. It was slightly worse with CPPC on preferred off, and I ran it twice. I put the ×2 because I was trying to get consistency. Whenever I got a weird low score, I would run the test and repeat it to see if that's really the score it was giving. Same on the single for CPPC on preferred on. I ran it twice just to see why is it getting only 573 and not 584 like with completely off. And it just turns out that either you want them both off or you just want preferred off, as you can see here. So with CPPC off, preferred off, I got a good single, and with CPPC on, preferred off, I got a good single on stock algorithm. I can't remember the name, not PBO, it's just whatever the stock behavior is with PBO disabled. That algorithm preferred to have the preferred setting, CPPC preferred core off, and it ran better. And then when I did the -30 curve, it ran even better under CPPC, and there was no point testing those because I know that those aren't as good. Or at least both off would have been fine. I reckon it would have been margin of error, but you can at least see, like which method do you need. I would recommend just avoiding this preferred setting. I think this is a setting they said they fixed, but I'm still not seeing, I wasn't seeing consistent scaling with this setting turned on. So you can just see here that the even multiple runs, the single was just down by 10 points. And even though it's 10 points could be margin of error for CBR, I even tried closing everything, including hardware info, and it still gave me a score of under 580, while multiple runs in both of these were able to give me, I think I did 3 runs each, were able to give me 580 plus every single time. And I think I just chose the best one. It was within margin of error, though, of 5 points. But again, this one could not break 580 on CBR20 single. And I wasn't like running other apps. I had nothing extracurricular running in the background. Except exit lag, which actually disables, lowers the priority of some background processes. But the reason I kept exit lag on is because I accidentally left it on for the first test, and just to keep it consistent, I left it on for every single one. But the reason it didn't matter as much is because to do the idle testing, which I was doing first, I would actually sit at the desktop to make sure all the background stuff had finished. And then once I see the idles dropped, as you can see these idle tests here, once the idle dropped to match the other settings, that's where I went, okay, the idle, like the background process and stuff done, now I'll do the testing. So I was actually giving a good gap in between every reboot to make sure that I was getting consistent results. and this was the outlier. It's just the preferred. It's the only difference. Like preferred was off in this one, preferred was off in this one, preferred on hurt performance of single. So yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys, and I do have Warzone coming up with CPPC modes being tested. Like, I've actually got the, I still have to fill some of this in because I've got to change to these modes and test them. But basically, I decided after doing my CPPC testing that for my CPPC and latency fix testing, which with the latest Agesa on the B450m Mortar Max, I decided I'll go with CPPC on, preferred off, because that gives the most advantage to both, like, all cores not affected, obviously. You can see the all cores fine in all of them, but it seems that if any of the settings are going to favor one mode over the other, preferred off has to be disabled, and so CPPC on helps the default algorithms, the AMD algorithms, perform a little bit lower power. So you can see here that with CPPC off, the idle power was 18 to 7.06 amps of current, but then with CPPC on in both of these, the idle current was down. So instead of 7, it was getting about 5 amps of idle current. And so that means CPPC on does have some kind of advantage to the power draw, and that should carry over. Like it's an advantage nevertheless, but the preferred on, because the preferred on was messing with the single, I had to choose preferred off. So CPPC on preferred off makes the most sense, and that's what I'll be testing all of these settings with under the new fixes for Windows 11. So the Microsoft patch and the AMD CPPC patch are both enabled on my system now, and I'll be going into Warzone once I can get a consistent mode to test in. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.